Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I want to talk about the new Brockhampton record, TM. TM is the latest studio album from hip-hop boy band turned critical sensations Brockhampton, one of the only boy band types to ever actually get a lot of hype within the music nerd community, second only to the Beatles, maybe, but beyond that, this is also supposedly the final Brockhampton album after they released what was initially announced to be their final project a day earlier than scheduled, The Family, a good but still deeply flawed record that was barely qualifiable as a Brockhampton album. We are now here with what is the actual final, supposedly, Brockhampton album, and while this does feel more traditionally Brockhampton than its predecessor, I actually enjoy this one significantly less, because although The Family was flawed, it still was a powerful record that felt like a legitimate send-off to the group as a whole, even if it was really just one single member, Kevin Abstract, throughout its entire runtime. And although all of the group's members for the most part are found here, this just feels like a lackluster wrap-up to the Brockhampton group's story. Now let me just say first things first, this album is well put together, I can't take that away from it or anything like that, and if TM as a record will do anything to you, whether you are a pre-established Brockhampton fan or you're a newcomer to the group that's only coming around now because you've heard about them finally just sort of throwing in the towel, then, you know, either which way, this has hooks, as choruses, they'll get stuck in your head, and that's something that I'll even admit to having happened to me. I mean, this record does have some hooks here or there that are legitimately catchy, well composed, well written, and song progressions here are done tastefully with no songs particularly overstaying their welcome or not staying long enough. That being said, none of these tracks feel like anything of substance beyond the fact that they're earworms, and while any half-decent or even mediocre band can produce an earworm, really, a song doesn't have to be good to get stuck in your head, so really what we're left with here is a bunch of songs that actually don't feel all that impressive in any way in terms of actual performance work from the members of Brockhampton or in terms of production, and all that's left is some well-written but ultimately lackluster tracks. Another big flaw found within TM is that it feels extraordinarily disjointed at times, almost as so bad that it actually doesn't even feel like a complete album in a way. It feels like there are tracks missing here that are meant to transition through these styles, and say what you want about the original final Brockhampton album, The Family, but despite that record's lack of solid creative direction, the genre hopping was often smoothly transitioned and songs bled into each other. Here on TM, the opposite is the same. The Family lacked creative direction, but it just sort of bled through together, so it worked, I suppose, but TM, it just feels like it has no particular creative direction, but it's obvious that Brockhampton want to go back through their history as a group, exploring all of these different subgenres within hip-hop and R&B that they've toyed with in the past, but the thing is, all of these tracks are just thrown here together, and there's obviously a concept in terms of instrumentals here, but really none of it works together because there's no legitimate attempt to transition from one song to another, and while I'm not the type of person to enjoy transitions that are individual tracks, I really do think that a couple of 10, 20 maybe second long transitions would have actually done nicely here in between some of the songs, just to kind of have a nice flow going instead of bouncing around from southern hip-hop to jazz rap to this sort of trap kind of sound to the sort of alternative R&B that they've played with in the past. It just kind of feels a little bit messy overall, and while I do appreciate what they were trying to do by sort of being a retrospective of the band's entire career and their evolution in terms of sonic aesthetics and subgenres, it just doesn't work out in the end. You could also make a solid argument that the most important aspect about TM would actually be how it feels as a sort of closing chapter for Brockhampton as a group, and initially, at least so that fans thought, The Family was supposed to be the final Brockhampton album. It was supposed to be the closing chapter of the band. After that, done and finito, over. And say what you will about The Family. It was a flawed record to be sure, but as far as closing up the Brockhampton story goes, it did it well, and it tied up loose ends by explaining the entire history of the band, albeit from the point of group member Kevin Abstract, who was the only member to appear on that record. And the opposite, again, is kind of true here. TM has most of the group's members found on it, and it does feel like a bit more variety-filled in that sense, but at the same time, in terms of an actual finale album for such a powerful and relevant group, it just feels wildly unfinished. I mean, obviously not every band's final album needs to be some sort of grand, sweeping, closing piece of their history, but I don't know, just at the same time, it really does kind of feel like there's no completion here. It just sort of feels like another average Brockhampton record, something that they would release as a mixtape randomly, and their fans would eat it up, and everyone else would just sort of look the other way towards other more interesting projects at the moment, waiting for Brockhampton to do something interesting again, but this isn't that. This is actually the final full Brockhampton album, or so they want you to think so far at least. Now call me a skeptic, but I refuse to believe this is the final Brockhampton album. I mean, the way that this record wraps up feels so indistinct and lacking in definition that I am genuinely saddened if this is meant to be the final record of the group that brought us the 3 Saturation albums. Look, Brockhampton haven't had the most steady or smooth career out there, between losing members due to a variety of different things, to internal arguments, to records that haven't necessarily been the highest quality, to experiments with different sounds that really haven't been super successful. There are problems, many problems actually, within the Brockhampton history, but at the same time, it really does kind of feel like a band of such monumental proportion should have had at least a better way to go out than this. And I mean, you know what, maybe this is the final Brockhampton album, but as it stands, I refuse to believe this is, or at the very least I hope it's not, and that at some point they do something else together, because if this truly is the end of Brockhampton as we know it, then this is kind of depressing actually. So overall, TM isn't a terrible album, but it feels horribly disjointed, and at the same time, it doesn't feel like a proper final chapter for Brockhampton. Actually, its predecessor, the still disjointed but somewhat more successful, in fact significantly more successful album, The Family, feels like a much better wrap-up for Brockhampton as a project, and that only had one member of Brockhampton on it. That's basically a Kevin Abstract solo album. But it just felt so much more successful, and if you are going to check out at least one of these 2 new Brockhampton albums, I do recommend checking out The Family, but as it stands, The Family is the final closing puzzle piece for Brockhampton in my opinion, and I'll just pretend like TM was a weird mixtape that happened a couple years back that no one ever talks about, because I honestly think that that would be the preferable universe or the preferable timeline. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.